The main thing was to separate, to segregate the Jews from the non-Jews. And don't forget, Jews were very active in all non-Jewish organizations before 33, and in opera houses, in theaters, in movies. I mean, it was a Jewish industry, just as it was here in America when it first started. And so they wanted to cut off this influence altogether.
It was formed because the Nazis did not permit the Jews to partake in their cultural events. That's why it was called Kulturbund, that means culture. And the only way to keep the people a little bit occupied with other things but emigrating and calling for numbers and things like that was culture. So that's how we formed this Kulturbund.
It was a refuge for the Jews, both the performers as well as the listeners. Second, it was a ghetto, because we were excluded from the environment in which we were used to breathe, which was the great city of Berlin with the great culture that was created by so many Jews, German and other Jews too, by the way, not just German Jews. And thirdly, it was an instrument of propaganda for the Nazis. Now, all this was maybe also mentioned by my parents, but I can tell you exactly now which is what I learned, what I remember from the discussions in those long nights in China, and later on with other people in Israel, and then later back here in Berlin.
My stepfather, William Steinberg, who was then called Hans Wilhelm Steinberg, who was born in Germany and a conductor in Germany, had been dismissed from his post at the Frankfurt Opera when the Nazis came in 1933, as all musicians had been, and all people who were state employees, as it were, because the orchestras were state orchestras, city orchestras, so the musicians were actually employed by the state. So he then became the conductor of the Frankfurt Kulturbund Orchestra.
My father received a letter from Julius Barb. If you want, I can read it in my poor English. Well, dear honored Mr. Barb, Hallelujah, hail to you. I already regard myself as a member of your purely Jewish theater. The question of money should not be an impediment. Do you know what it means to me to be acting again? Warmest regards from Fitz Wisten.
And so my parents decided they had to send me away, even if it had to be Palestine at that point, which, thank goodness, they found a place closer to home. It was a Jewish boarding school that had been founded, I believe, by the Federation of Berlin, Federation of Jewish Philanthropies, probably in Berlin. And my parents had relatives in Berlin, and through them they found this place. I was there for 2 wonderfully happy years until I immigrated to America. And while I was there, only once was I taken to the Kulturbund to see an opera.
I would say that it's always important for minorities and the idea that persecuted people have the energy to go beyond not being persecuted, or rather beyond surviving persecution, but quite on the contrary, doing something on their own which transcends not being persecuted, is of course terribly important. And somehow it finds its application in all modes of life, whether they're Nazis or not. It's some way where people are made to feel either neglected or inferior or something like that. And if one can gather the strength to not only overcome that, but doing something sensational that transcends all this, it's worth its weight in gold.
It was a great relief, believe me, because the people who came there were eager to find an atmosphere again where they could enjoy what they'd enjoyed before. there were actually 2 Gestapo men with each performance who watched the show. And the rule was only Jews would be allowed to enter. And when they came outside, there were more than one Nazis outside. There was a different climate. It was something they had been used to. But they found a home. They found a home. It was an exhilarating atmosphere. The way they responded to what we had to offer them, if it was theater, and especially music. Especially music.
You were no longer permitted to go to the coffee houses or restaurants. They all had signs, Jews are not wanted. You could not go to the movies anymore. You could not go to concerts or theaters. So we were excluded culturally. So all that was left was either you did the chamber music at home, which we did, or you had the Liederkranz. And after we were excluded from cultural life in Germany, the Liederkranz evolved into the Kulturbund. The orchestra was founded, and we continued to give concerts and to play. And in retrospect today, I think it cannot be emphasized enough, this was the beginning of resistance.
At that time, every piece of music was open for us. The ban on the Kulturbund not to play German music came after my time. I didn't live through this. But we played, our first concert was Schubert, Mendelssohn and Beethoven. Mendelssohn, of course, was special for us because they didn't play it anymore.
My father was such a German, you know, more German than the Germans. And he never knew anything of Yiddish. And he despised Yiddish as the West Jews and the East Jews. But one day he discovered that Yiddish and the Yiddish culture and literature is simply great, just as great as the German, the Schillers and the Goethes and the Lessings. And so he started in the Kulturbund what he called der jüdische Bilderbogen. That was a set of performances only in Yiddish. And that must have been something great. And all these German Jews who were just as Jeckes as my father learned the power and the beauty and the humor of Yiddish. All of a sudden they knew who was Sholem Aleichem. Never heard before.
I was in Berlin, and after the Crystal Night, I could not work anymore in my profession as a dressmaker. I just learned as a dressmaker, and I got a job in 1939 at the Kulturbund when they started rehearsing for the Countess Maritza. And since I'm not an actress nor can sing, they needed the people. Statisten, as they called it, the people on the stage, and that was me. And that's how I happened to come to the Kulturbund.
Kurt Singer was a doctor and a friend of my mother's. And he had the mistaken impression that he could salvage the Kulturbund beyond the Nazis, which he had to pay with his life because it was a mistake. Of course, there was no way of saving the Kulturbund. He just made it work for as long as he could. And that's why we could get all these wonderful performances done. But then he went, I think, to Holland and stupidly came back because I wanted to help the Kulturbund, and then ended up together with my parents in Theresienstadt in the concentration camp. And while my parents were lucky enough to get out, he didn't, and so he died there.
It was during the night, and I knew very well the next day I would be gassed. Now, if you are 18 years old, you know from a logical point of view that my parents are dead, my brother's dead, nobody could go through that. Why should I? It will be the end for me. But from the emotional side, you said, what the hell? I'm not going to die with 18 years. And I try my utmost to get out of this mess. Now, one of the prison doctors came around, saw that I was awake. And so he started a conversation. All will be better and so on. I said, no, come on, cut it out. I know what's giving, tomorrow it's finished. And he said, well, where are you from? I said, from Dresden. And I asked, where are you from? He said, from Breslau. I said, from Breslau? I played in Breslau for the Jewish Kulturbund with the orchestra, a soloist. And the man said, were you the little boy who played the Tartini concerto? I said, yes, it was me. Oh, he said, I was at this concert. And he said, wait a minute. Well, I had lots to wait. Couldn't do, and disappeared. And came back carrying a dead body over his shoulder, plunked this body next to me, picked me up and carried me out of the barrack into the next barrack. And then, of course, he had to exchange the cards. We were in a filing system, and my card had to be according to the number which is tattooed on my arm. He did this all, and then he took care of me several days afterwards, got me a good job, and I was back in life.
I would like to nowadays tell people that if something like this would happen in this country, God forbid, to imagine that all the top artists of Lincoln Center, the Metropolitan Opera House, our movies, our books, if everyone who is of Jewish religion or had one Jewish grandparent would be totally prohibited to follow their profession. And those people grouped themselves together and formed the Kulturbund.